Time again for another installment of the basics, and I'm switching back over to the Star Trek CCG. I'm a busy boy today. I've been making a lot of episodes. But anyways, this one is deck versus deck. I'm answering a question from a viewer about the difference that I have between my tournament deck and house deck. So let me show you. Now, let me start by saying first and foremost that any deck I have made up for tournament play is more than adequate to be used in house rules games. So there's no issue there. But I do have several decks put together that are strictly for house rule games, or I use them when I'm playing my version of the Star Trek CCG Solitaire that I created. Now, the differences between a tournament deck and a house game deck, and this is just for me, this is just what I do, so take it with a grain of salt if you'd like, or compare with your own decks. The difference is this. In my tournament deck, and I'm using my Federation deck as an example, the missions are more suited towards the affiliation. So I have a lot of single affiliation missions that are Federation specific, and they're tailored to the skill set that my personnel have. My ships are few. I only have 3 ships in this deck, but they are powerful, and when I have the enhancements from various other cards, they're all I need. My dilemmas are meant to not only confuse my opponent, but also kill off a lot of his personnel. That's important in a tournament deck. You don't want to mess around with dilemmas that don't do a hell of a lot. You want to get to the point early on. My power cards, which are events and interrupts, are just that. They are very powerful. They're suited to doing a lot in a short span of time. I don't mess about with them. My personnel are all heavy hitters. As I've mentioned before, I have the bridge crew from First Contact, as well as other main characters in the affiliation that are loaded with attributes that can help me out greatly and quickly. And the biggest difference between one of my tournament decks and a house deck is my tournament decks have Q's Tent side decks. I don't generally use a Q's Tent side deck in a deck that's built for house play because I want to keep it simple and I want to have fun. I don't want to keep reaching into a Q's Tent side deck if possible. I have used them in the occasional house deck just for shits and giggles, but for the most part I leave them in tournament decks. Now, moving over to a house deck, and I'm using my Klingon deck as an example because this is the epitome of a house deck for me at least. I have several Klingon-centric missions, but the rest are multiple affiliation missions. I could care less in a house game if my opponent wants to start attempting the missions that I put out. It adds a bit more fun to a house game. Some of my dilemmas can kill the opponent and or confuse. Some of them are weak, and some of them are just dual-purpose space and planetary mission designed to, more than anything, keep him from completing the mission, much less do any kind of death or damage. My power cards, there are a few power cards in both interrupts and events, but I use more generic cards in this deck because I'm not out to destroy my opponent or have a quick victory. If it's a house deck for a game with friends, or even if I'm using it as a solitaire deck, I want to have fun. Personnel, I have greater quantity of personnel in this deck. They do the job. They're not over the top. If I want to have over the top personnel with heavy attributes, I will switch them out and turn this into a tournament deck. I've done that in the past. But in this case, they're adequate for the deck and the missions I have set out. Finally, I have more ships in this deck. I have 4 to 5 birds of prey, sometimes the occasional Vorcha. I use these ships in this deck because the staffing icons are limited. I can get them moving quicker and I don't have to worry about putting too many crew on one ship. I can just go about my business. That is the biggest difference in my house deck. And of course, there is no Q's Tent side deck in this house deck. I've kept it simple. That way I can have the maximum amount of fun. Can I use this deck in a tournament? I can try, but I know it's going to get whooped very quickly. That's why I have several tournament decks put together, like my Federation deck, my Borg deck, and my Ferengi deck. They are all set up for tournaments, whereas my Klingon deck, my Romulan deck, and my Cardassian deck are more set up for house rules. Now, that being said, one of the other differences between decks is that a tournament deck, you've pretty much spent a lot of time making it up for one purpose, to go into that tournament and defeat everybody else. Whereas a house deck, you can play around with it, you can have some fun. I've made up a smaller Federation deck of more of the minor characters and ships for house games, just to have a fun. And yeah, it got shellacked once or twice. I ended up taking it apart because it didn't work, but it was a hell of a lot of fun to play with, and that's what you can do with house decks. Whereas your tournament decks, you've spent more time to set them up just the way you want them for that purpose. Have a great day, everybody.